Hello and welcome to Office of Harbour for October. It is currently pretty much mid-November. I have just been having a really good time with life, I'll be honest. Things have been interesting, lots of things have been happening, and I've been able to talk more in person with people about literature and books, which means that I haven't been quite as motivated to talk online. But I did finish reading quite a few in October, and I will just completely forget what they're all about if we don't talk about it now. So, Vineland by Thomas Pynchon is my because I didn't want to in October. I still haven't watched One Battle After Another, which is the Paul Thomas Anderson movie that this book inspired. And I chose to read this because I did want to watch it and think about adaptations, and then I just never found the time. But Vineland itself is Pynchon in his usual style, writing about the 80s, and something about it just doesn't work as well for me. And I have just a lot of uncertainty about that. So we follow Zoid, who is a man who's trying to get like a disability pension or a mental health money scheme by jumping through a window exactly once every year. His daughter, Prairie, and his ex-wife, Renessie, form this interesting family dynamic where they've been involved in various socialist political activations and movements within this 1980s Ronald Reagan era. And so this is a novel about secret societies and political factions trying to manipulate and alter the course of political discourse within America, often through things like violence. And knowing really just how embedded the CIA was into American society in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, I think this conspiracy theme is very necessary to think about the ways that I don't want to use those really cliche terms like Illuminati and New World Order and all of that, but there is definitely an undercurrent of paranoia and conspiracy within American politics. It's one of the reasons why I imagine it's kind of the way it is now, is that people are primed for this. People are used to the fact that there are going to be mysterious actors and strange butterfly effect circumstances that affect who is in power and what kind of policies they can enact. Sometimes it's very carefully plotted and planned, and sometimes it's just completely chaotic and random. And so Pynchon's writing has always been kind of about this. So reading about The Crime on Lot 49, which is kind of like that for the 60s, and then Gravity's Rainbow, which is kind of like that for the post-war 1940s. Both of those times to me were removed enough that I could recognize that it was trying to have its own fun, and it wasn't... I mean, thematically it was interesting in the terms of how we didn't know absolute truth, and we were kind of at the mercy of all this randomness in the world. Whereas now that we moved to the 1980s, I just feel like there's a greater degree of responsibility that authors need to have about how they write about politics, because the people who are doing the voting and the people who are following certain political figures, and not just political figures but cultural movements of today, are still alive. They're not people who... Well, largely these movements still reverberate today. And so when a significant, very significant subplot about this novel is about going to Japan and training in sexy female ninja tactics to try and get information out of people, I think that to me is kind of jumping the shark. Even though this basically exact same thing happens in Gravity's Rainbow, Gravity's Rainbow somehow got a pass for me, and Vineland doesn't. Maybe because this book is shorter, maybe because it is more interested in its female characters, and it makes it more apparent to me that I think the female characters aren't quite as well done. It is about this interesting father-daughter relationship and the way that the previous generation can influence or care for the next generation. How political views start from very young, and then eventually, through discovery of how the world works and through interaction with various factions, people change their views or evolve or even follow or support somebody that they previously would have tried to kill. All of this is in there, and it's all interesting to discuss, but then the actual experience of reading the novel and just kind of wading through the chaos of it all of all the silly jokes and the pop culture references and the sentences that are really quite hard to follow. And a lot of this feels like a joke at the expense of the reader sometimes. I would give it a 3 out of 5. And I'm very curious to see how the movie deals with a lot of the elements of this book. This book is not one which I would say has aged very well. And I wonder if time will be more kind to this book. I wonder if in 20 or 30 years, when we've really forgotten the more pressing political implications of the Ronald Reagan era, we can then go back and read this as if we were to read Gravity's Rainbow and laugh at it. Maybe. I don't know. Book number 2, my yearly challenge, The Longest Journey by E.M. Forster. I adore E.M. Forster's style of writing. I think he's just a very accessible classic author that gives you the best of both the late Victorian era and the early modernist era. He has characters and stories that are interested in social dynamics and culture, interested in ideas about social class and psychology, but are also just very quiet and pleasant, and yet not pompous in a way that some Victorian novels can be. So all in all, I think that I find E.M. Forster's work very enjoyable, although The Longest Journey to me is not the most of that. And I find it interesting because E.M. Forster himself has said that this is his favorite one of his works. It is a novel about Ricky, who is a university student, and he is on his way to becoming a professor, but he instead chooses to marry a woman named Agnes. Now, Agnes is not a widower, but she was dating this footballer who dies in this freak accident. And because she's left alone, Ricky realizes his chance and marries her. Agnes is not a very enlightened woman, and so together they have a middle-class life. He becomes a school teacher, he has trouble controlling his classes, and he wonders a lot about really what the meaning of life is. There's this suggestion that Ricky was kind of destined towards this life as a writer and a philosopher, and never quite made it. Ricky is a writer himself, and he writes interesting and kind of fanciful fantasy and science fiction short stories, which is also kind of similar to E.M. Forster. E.M. Forster has quite a pronounced sci-fi short story backlog, but it doesn't really factor in any of his major novels. Ricky is unable to find success as an author, and part of this is because Agnes is just not really someone that he can bounce ideas off. Agnes is constantly worrying more about Ricky's just day-to-day work life and is overall just quite uninspiring. And so it's a novel about people being sad, and yet as much as I would want to compare to something like D.H. Lawrence or Henry James, where they are writing aesthetically about characters being sad, E.M. Forster is just really happy to still dwell on a moment, to have a little conversation, to write about the built environment and the natural environment, to talk in very casual terms about characters and their mindscapes and psychologies. It's not a novel that feels like it's trying to crush me, whereas a novel like Lady Chatterley's Lover or The Portrait of a Lady, both of those have their own seriousnesses to them that signal to me that this is mostly a psychological novel. This is mostly a novel that is interested in portraying an idea, and so you don't necessarily have to enjoy it. Whereas I think the balance between enjoyability and not sentimentality, but psychology in this work just doesn't quite hit it for me. I think I love The Room with a View, I love Passage to India, I loved Where Angels Fear to Tread. I think all of those books worked really well as straightforward dramas, and they had that interesting subcurrent of sociopolitics and culture in order to make their drama stories just a bit more meaningful. Whereas this one is primarily a drama story, and it just didn't quite do it for me. I also find it weird, most of the E.M. Forster's novels were like this, but especially this one becomes more pronounced, where death is just not that serious sometimes. Characters will just die mid-sentence, and the emotional gravitas of their death is just not dwelled upon, because these aren't really books that are interested in death. They're interested in the people that stay alive and how they react to the events of death. But I mean, when a character dies during a football game, how did that even happen? It's just a sentence that just says, and he was playing football and then he died. It was just, anyways, I was confused. I would give it a 3 out of 5. Love E.M. Forster, and sad that I couldn't enjoy the work that he enjoyed the most from his own collection. But I mean, maybe I'll revisit one day. I might make a video when I finish all the E.M. Forster novels, and I will think about this one a bit more. But this novel, to me, having read 3 of his other works, feels like a novel where he's trying to be something other than what he's good at. And I don't know, I think history has kind of vindicated that there's other authors working in this space that have been more interesting than what this has been to me. Next one, because I wanted to, this is a loan from a friend. How to Write an Autobiographical Novel by Alexander Chee is a collection of essays where a Asian American author is reflecting on his experiences going to the Iowa's Writers' Circle, growing up as a gay half Asian man in America, and also his various occasions within his writerly life, moments where symbols and metaphors became really ingrained in him, and where he thought about ultimately what it means to be a writer. What does it mean to include details of your life in your work? And also, if you have some kind of trauma in your life, or especially the kind of traumatic backstory that Alexander Chee has in his life, how do you render that in writing in a way that's true to yourself and meaningful to your reader? And do you have to do something to it? Do you have to labor with it, or sit with it, or transform it in such a way that it does work in fiction? Or can you just render it out? What will it do to the audience, and what will it do to you as the author? How many times can you write your own life story and still be meaningful, not just to someone else, but also to you yourself? It is a set of essays that I find really interesting in the way that Chee is just constantly rediscovering himself. He is reciting elements of his life and expanding and contracting time in a way that would allow him to recognize just how formative some of the experiences he's had are. But also he uses time in such an interesting way. He talks about how he must have felt at a certain period of that life. He writes about waiting tables, he writes about house sitting and taking care of roses, and he writes about what it felt like in that moment, but also later in his life, having completed his novel and having become more of an established writer. Ultimately, what does that mean for him? What is the significance of going to the Writers' Circle and studying under Annie Dillard? What is the significance of the AIDS epidemic and the participation that he had in various protests against the government's treatment of AIDS patients? All of this is interesting. It's a really interesting chronicle of life in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, mostly 80s and 90s, I guess. But all of this feels very true, and all of this feels very meaningful. And ultimately, I felt very, very called out by reading this, because as someone who is working on a novel, and a novel, I guess I subscribe to that saying that everything's an autobiography to some extent. Yeah, like, it's true, and I thought that I could just, throw it under the bed and not think about it. And this is a set of essays that really, it shows Chee chastising himself for this mentality, but I feel chastised by association. I think that I can't really just ignore the fact that I am writing about a character having experiences somewhat similar to my own. And I also can't ignore the fact that this might be meaningful to someone else in a way that it was hopefully meaningful to me. So, having not read Edinburgh, which is the novel that Alexander Chee is writing about in most of these essays, I may also want to come back to this one. I did feel quite inspired, but ultimately just called out. I think I needed to introspect after reading this. I think I have been able to progress in my novel's progress by not thinking about stuff, and I think that ultimately to make it a better novel, I will need to think about stuff at some point. So I appreciate this book for making me think about stuff. It's a 4 out of 5, but also thinking about stuff is hard and painful, and I don't always want to do that. Talking about a Shakespeare play for this month, The Merry Wives of Windsor is a bad play. It is a comedy that stars John Falstaff of Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 fame, and it is about John Falstaff creating this get-rich-quick scheme by hitting on multiple women at once in Windsor in order to try and get their dowries. And the women are aware of this, and so they basically scam him as many times as they can and lead him into these situations where he's made a fool of. This, I guess, is trying to be like the early scenes of Henry IV Part 1, where the characters are kind of playing around, and what made those early scenes work for me? First of all, they were very physical. They were out and about in pastoral areas, and they had characters kind of running around different sides of the stage. Merry Wives of Windsor is not quite as physically interesting, but Merry Wives of Windsor 2, the power dynamics just don't create as much interest. And I thought this play might have been more interesting because the characters with the agency are, for the most part, women. But The play seems very reluctant at making Falstaff too much the butt of the joke. Falstaff as a character needs to survive, and that was very true in Henry IV Part 1 and 2. Even though he was eventually rejected by Hal, he is a character that managed to skim through society based on his charisma alone. He doesn't really offer anything. He's not attractive, he's old, he's drunk, he's poor, he doesn't have like anything that Elizabethan society would really respect. And yet because he's funny, because he's optimistic, and because he's shrewd, he's able to kind of dodge all the criticism coming his way. And so because of this, the women that make fun of Falstaff come off about as bad as Falstaff do, because Falstaff doesn't seem to suffer the torments that they have for him quite as much. And in the same way, Falstaff works really well as a character when you're playing him off someone who is meant to be high class, like Hal. That Hal, his big character arc was that he was being tainted by Falstaff, and the public image that this young prince had, hanging out with this person who has no value in Elizabethan society, was something that was really significant to Hal. We were interested not just in what Falstaff was doing, but how Hal's relationship with Falstaff affects his future. In the Merry Wives of Windsor, we just don't really have that. We just have characters messing around, joking with one another. Even the core theme of money and dowry is just not explored that much, compared to something like The Merchant of Venice, which is really interested in how money transfers in marital or romantic relationships. The Merry Wives of Windsor just kind of uses the money as an afterthought, is just not really something that matters that much. There is also a romantic subplot as well. We have multiple men trying to win the favor of one woman and her, was it parents or guardians? I can't remember exactly what anymore, but they're trying to do a bunch of schemes to make sure the right person wins. This subplot is also kind of bad. There's a lot of like foreign stereotyping in here, and it's just like, I get why no one performs this play. It's just not that good. There's comedies that are funnier, and there are so many comedies, and you would think that each of these would bring something new to the table, and I would say this is one of those ones where it really doesn't. It is even a bit less than fine. I would give it a 2 out of 5. I feel bad for having read this. It tarnishes the legacy of Shakespeare, if anything. You're just like, oh, this guy just needed to make some cash for this play, I guess. Okay, something light, Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. A bizarrely Christian book. I will get to that in a moment, but the concept of this is we have two performance poets who perform together, Francis and Bobby. So Francis is the first person narrator, Bobby is the more outgoing of the two. They were in a relationship at one point and they broke up, but they stay together, they're friends. Francis and Bobby meet Melissa and her husband Nick. Nick is an actor and Melissa is a literary critic, I believe. And so Bobby starts a relationship with Melissa and Francis starts sleeping with Nick. This gets really complicated because the friendship between Francis and, like, it's a love square. The love story between Francis and Nick is super complicated. Nick is being unfaithful to his wife, but also he sees in Francis, well, there's about like a 10-year age difference. He sees in Francis something that he can't quite express or explain, and he's not ready to try and make any kind of commitment with her, and yet he enjoys their physical relations a lot. And yet Francis, being so young, she doesn't understand what she wants in her life either. She doesn't know how she wants to be treated by a man, and so she lets herself get carried along by this. Melissa is at first presented to be this quite controlling figure, but as the story develops, we recognize just how difficult it is for her to be in this current status with Nick, how their relationship in the arts world and their ongoing friendship with Francis and Bobby as well is just complicated. And so you wonder with someone like Melissa, like, what is the wise and measured thing to do? Or do you also act based on your emotions? And lastly, Bobby, this outgoing person, is living life based on her own inhibitions, and in that way contrasts so much with Francis as well. So we're interested in just the full box. Like, there's 6 relationships in this quadrangle, I guess, and all of them are somewhat interesting, all of them are a bit tragic, and nothing is clean, nothing is really clear. This is not a romance novel. This is not a novel where things work out well. I am reminded quite a bit of Love and Virtue, which I know came after this, but a novel that is about how relationships under these circumstances that begin with these underlying conflicts and kind of go against the fabric of what we expect from society, whether it is a relationship with someone that's already in a marital partnership, or an age differential, or anything like that, power differentials. There's always going to be something that goes wrong. And so this is a novel about navigating those things that go wrong. And interestingly, midway through the novel, I guess because it's set in Ireland, there's a lot of discussion about faith and about Christianity. We have characters going to church or reading the Bible and expressing these ideas as a kind of contrast to the damage they feel in their relationships. And so whilst I don't necessarily think this is a Christian novel or a one that's trying to proselytize to its audience, it does position Christian monogamy as a contrast to the complicated, emotional, very fiery relationships that exist within the quadrangle of the four main characters. And what is that trying to say? I don't know. But I think there is a reading where there's quite a moralistic judgment of these four characters, that maybe the thing they should have done is just reconcile their conflicts early and not let things get as bad as they did. At least me as a Christian looking at this, that seems like the logical solution for them. But life doesn't always work in logical solutions, and I guess it's also a novel that wants to sit with and abide with characters that are hurting so much because of this. That each of these characters does desire a kind of understanding and fulfillment and connection, and the way they look for it and the way they interpret it leads them to various forms of suffering. And so it's fine. Like, I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most profound way of looking at it. It is just a messy relationship novel. It is quite a nice page turner. I like just how well the description is paced. The dialogue is also really well done. It's easy to read, and despite how messy the relationships are, it's easy to follow, and it doesn't feel gratuitous. It doesn't feel like tabloidy when it really could have. Instead, you do feel that it cares for its characters a lot. I did feel very invested in the happiness of each of these characters. And so, for that, I still give it a 3 out of 5. I think it's not really a book that I'm going to remember that much. Sally Rooney as an author has become so popular. So many books have made it to bestseller lists. I think I like Normal People more just because from that novel, I got more of that sensorial quality because it was maybe because about younger characters and I could sympathize with their situation a bit more. I guess because I would never see myself in a situation like this, whereas Normal People, like, I can map some of my own experiences to that story. And I think also structurally, Normal People did things that I wasn't expecting. And I guess maybe given the bias that it was my first of her novels, it still was fresh to me. Whereas Conversation with Friends, to me, is a wholly successful novel that has some interesting points to grapple onto, and that's about as far as I can go with that. Lastly, we're talking about something spooky. The Lottery and Other Stories by Shirley Jackson is a interesting collection, and it's one that I'm really glad that I read. I love Shirley Jackson. Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle are two of some of my favorite novels, and I always find it interesting to talk to people who have read both and ask which one they like more. I am a big Haunting of Hill House fan. I really like the way that novel kind of plays tricks on the reader and has all these different characters going through situations, and it's such a lingering image to me, just constantly throughout this strange house, whereas We Have Always Lived in the Castle is, in its own way, a bit more domestic and a bit more feminine, a bit more paranoid and xenophobic. You feel other characters judging you inwardly, which is much more potent in terms of thematics. Whereas looking at The Lottery and Other Stories, so The Lottery is that very famous short story that a lot of high school students will do, especially in America. It is about this town's weird ritual that ends up in someone being killed. I don't feel bad spoiling that because it's an old story and everyone kind of has heard about it. Whereas a lot of the other stories in this collection, to me, have this lingering fear of domesticity. We have lots of stories about young women raising families or becoming mothers for the first time, the evils of children, the evils of neighbors and strangers. There's stories about interacting with upstairs and downstairs neighbors and just strange behaviors. and dialogue that is just a little bit off, so that makes you paranoid. I'm not sure if there even is a sense of supernatural at play here. There is always a kind of plausible, realistic out. Every story, because it's set in the real world, it's often set in a city or a suburb, there are always just straightforward explanations that don't belie something sinister. But there's always that feeling too of what if there is something sinister? What if there is a demon here? What if there is a ghost or a haunting or something? I think it's a really fun experience to try and read through these short stories and try to find where the demons are, like where are the demons? A story like Charles, for example, about a kid that's being sent to school for the first time and he's learning bad influences from some of his friends. You can read that story and you think, oh, this is a story about a mother who is seeing things because she's letting her son go out into the world for the first time. Or you can read that story and go, oh, there's a demon, there's a demon, there's a demon. You know, like, I think that makes it so fun because I love a horror story that is just not clear about exactly what it is. I think that just makes it so much more compelling to me that I can read it multiple times, I can think about how different people might interpret it, that a story might show something different about someone's personality, about their view on the world, about their morality, just based on their own proclivities. I think that's really cool, and I think that's something I really want to do with my novel that I'm working on, is that whilst I'm not writing horror, I do like the idea of delving into the reader's thought process by presenting something that could be supernatural or could not be. And so I really, really recommend this collection. I would give it a 4 out of 5 just because I think that not every story is paced very well. There are some stories that drag a little bit, and putting them all together like this, I think Shirley Jackson's a writer that has a few really good tricks up her sleeve, but having them all together, one after the other, I think I also must have read it way too fast as well. There are things you see coming. There are stories that feel a bit samey to one another. And this makes me feel sad because not every story that she's written is in this collection, and there are some I've read from her later works that would have been really great contrasts to some of the ones that we see here. I guess maybe that's what her later collections, her posthumous collections are trying to do, whereas the reading experience of The Lottery and other stories overall is quite good. I think I like her novels more though. I have done myself a great kindness this month and not read a Booker Prize winner, so these are my 4 physical books, and then there's 2 on screen here and there that were online. 6 books a month is, to me, slow, but I think I'm getting through them at a good pace. I am having something fun to say about each one, and I don't see myself slowing down at all. So all of this is very good. I am on track to finishing 100 this year as well, and then next year. I'm getting excited to finish some of these silly challenges that I'm doing. I'm getting excited to have finally read a book from every year since the year 1900s. From the year 1900, I'm getting really excited to possibly finish every Booker Prize winner. I'm getting excited to finish every Shakespeare play. All of that will happen next year, so things are good, things are looking up. And of course, thank you everyone for joining, and I will see you next month.